The sound of the impact wasn't metal grinding. It was a deep, crushing thud that instantly plunged my world into darkness. And I knew the routine ambulance call had just become a target extraction. They didn't just want the patient. They wanted everyone who saw the specialized, illegal weapon that silenced the suburban street. The air in the ambulance was thick, a suffocating mix of antiseptic, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I was Leo EMT, and tonight was supposed to be routine. A late-night call, an elderly gentleman, dizzy spell, nothing dramatic. We were just pulling away from the curb of that quiet suburban cul-de-sac, the flashing blue and red lights painting the neat hedges in frantic, silent screams, when everything dissolved into chaos. My partner, Maria, was already working the patient in the back, her movements practiced and calm, the steady beep of the monitor a fragile anchor in the darkness. I was focused on the road, navigating the familiar, poorly lit streets back toward the main highway, mentally ticking off the checklist for the ER handover. 32 years old, 10 years on the job, and I thought I'd seen every permutation of human misery the night could offer. I was wrong. It happened so fast that my brain still processes it in staggered frames. We were maybe 2 blocks from the main thoroughfare, the siren a low, mournful howl, when I saw the headlights. Not just lights, a blinding, aggressive wall of light coming straight for us, ignoring every traffic signal, every reasonable rule of the road. This wasn't just a speeder. This felt deliberate. "Maria, brace yourself," I yelled, my voice automatically amplified by the radio mic strapped to my collar. I jammed the brakes, throwing my weight against the steering column as the heavy vehicle shuddered. The patient lurched, and I heard a sharp grunt from Maria, followed by the screech of the gurney wheels locking hard against the floor track. The oncoming vehicle, a huge, dark SUV, didn't even slow down. It didn't try to swerve. It just barreled toward our driver's side door, its intent unmistakable. I wrenched the wheel hard right, praying the momentum would carry us clear. But the sheer mass of the SUV was overwhelming. The impact wasn't a screech of metal. It was a deep, crushing thud. Everything went sideways. The world tilted 90 degrees, the siren peaking into a distorted, dying wail as the emergency lights shorted out, plunging the cab into near-total darkness, save for the fractured emergency glow reflecting off the interior chrome. Shrapnel sounded like angry hornets buzzing past my head. The airbags deployed with concussive force, smelling sharply of burnt chemicals. I was disoriented, pinned against the crushed driver's side window, tasting blood, mine, I hoped. My ears were ringing so violently that for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. The sheer violence of the collision had stopped the ambulance dead, spinning us halfway into the intersection, blocking both lanes. Then, through the ringing, I heard Maria. "Leo, are you hit? Patient status?" "Shaken," I managed, pulling myself upright, my shoulders screaming in protest. "Check the patient, Maria, now." I fumbled with my seatbelt, finally freeing myself, and peered out the shattered windshield. The dark SUV that hit us hadn't fled. That was the first red flag. It was stopped about 20 feet ahead, its front end crumpled like aluminum foil, but its massive engine was still running, idling with a deep, unnerving rumble. The driver's side door swung open slowly, deliberately. A figure emerged, tall, heavily built, wearing dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little ambient light was left from the street lamps down the block. He didn't look like a standard road rager. There was no shouting, no frantic apology, just stillness. He was moving with a terrifying economy of motion. Maria slid open the rear door, her face pale but set. "Leo, the patient is conscious, but his vitals are spiking from the trauma. We need to move him, now. Get a tow. Call it in." That's when the figure by the SUV took a step toward us, and I saw his hand lift. It wasn't empty. He was holding something long, dark, and undeniably not a cell phone. My training kicked in, overriding the pain and the shock. This wasn't an accident. This was an ambush. The goal wasn't to total the vehicle. The goal was to stop us. "Maria, forget the call," I roared, my voice ragged but commanding. "This isn't a standard MVA. He's armed. Get the patient out the back. Now. Use the side street. We have to scatter." The man by the SUV heard me. He stopped his measured advance. He raised the object he held, and the faint light caught the metal just enough for me to recognize the stark, unforgiving profile of some type of illegal weapon. Not a small handgun. This looked heavy, serious. The air fractured again, not with the sound of another impact, but with a deafening, sharp crack that ripped through the humid night. The bullet struck the rear panel of the ambulance, right where the stretcher anchors were located, the sound like a hammer blow on steel. Maria screamed, a short, sharp sound of pure terror, and then she was gone, pulling the patient toward the rear exit, shoving him out into the shadow of the alleyway. I knew I couldn't just run. If I left Maria exposed, she was done. My only advantage was the wrecked bulk of the ambulance itself. I kicked the driver's side door fully open and dove out, rolling toward the front bumper, trying to use the massive engine block as cover. "Hey!" I shouted, hoping to draw the shooter's attention fully onto me. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drum solo against the silence that had immediately followed the first shot. The man by the SUV didn't waste time. He started moving again, this time with purpose, closing the distance quickly, his silhouette growing larger, more menacing. I clawed blindly at my belt, reaching for the small trauma kit I always carried. Useless against whatever he had. I was exposed, crouched behind a dead vehicle, and I could hear Maria dragging the patient somewhere into the darkness behind the alley wall. The shooter was maybe 30 feet away. He stopped dead, his weapon leveled. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, bracing for the next report. Then a voice, not Maria's, not mine, but a deep, gravelly voice that seemed to materialize from the shadows across the street, cutting through the tension like a razor. "Driver, stop right there. Put it down. Now." It was a different authority. It wasn't the police. It was too calm, too gravelly. The shooter hesitated, glancing rapidly toward the sound. That hesitation bought me a split second. I saw my opening. I scrambled backwards, ducking under the ambulance frame, hoping to reach the passenger side where Maria might have found some cover. I was halfway under the chassis when the gravelly voice repeated its command, louder this time, laced with undeniable menace. I said, "Hide! Get down! They're coming for everyone!" And before I could process what that meant, who they were, why an unknown voice was telling me to hide instead of apprehending the armed attacker, the air was ripped apart by a sound that dwarfed the previous gunshot. It wasn't a small crack. It was a monstrous, tearing roar, immediately followed by the sickening crunch of heavy steel impacting something soft, followed by the sound of breaking glass everywhere. Then, absolute, suffocating silence descended on the street. The engine of the attacker's SUV sputtered once, then died. I was frozen beneath the ambulance, my body rigid with primal fear, listening to the silence that followed the explosion of sound. The only thing I could hear, vibrating inside my own skull, was the ringing in my ears and the terrifying realization that whatever had just crashed was not another car. It felt targeted. It felt massive. And whatever it was, it had just obliterated the spot where the man with the weapon had been standing moments before. I slowly raised my head, peering out from under the wreckage, and saw only smoke, a thick, acrid plume rising where the attacker stood. The smoke was instantaneous, black and oily, rising in a tight column against the sickly orange glow of the distant streetlights. It smelled wrong, not like burned rubber or gasoline, but something sharper, almost chemical, layered over the scent of ozone. The silence that followed the monstrous impact was profound, the kind of silence that swallows all lesser noises. Even the distant wail of sirens, which should have been approaching by now, seemed muted, as if the very atmosphere had thickened to absorb sound. I stayed low, pressed flat against the cold, grease-slicked asphalt under the ambulance chassis. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest cavity. "They're coming for everyone," the voice echoed in my mind, a chilling warning that instantly reshaped this entire night from a simple ambush into something far more organized and sinister. Where was Maria? "Maria?" I whispered, the sound barely audible even to myself. No response. I couldn't see around the rear of the wrecked ambulance, and the smoke obscured the alleyway where she'd dragged our patient. Slowly, agonizingly, I began to crab crawl toward the passenger side door, moving like a wounded insect. Every muscle screamed from the impact, but the adrenaline was a cruel master, forcing movement while dulling true pain. When I finally cleared the front corner of the ambulance and looked toward the intersection, the scene was surreal. The dark SUV was gone. Not just disabled, but gone. Where it had been parked was a massive scorch mark, a deep, radiating divot in the asphalt, and debris scattered everywhere. Metal fragments larger than dinner plates, twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Whatever had hit that intersection hadn't been a conventional vehicle, and there was no sign of the man who had been aiming the weapon at me. He had vanished, either vaporized or moved with impossible speed, immediately following that earth-shattering crash. I forced myself to stand, swaying precariously. My vision swam, forcing me to lean against the ambulance frame. "Maria, emergency response code, where are you?" I used the handheld radio clipped to my vest, bypassing the damaged dash system. Static hissed back, followed by a weak, ragged sound. "Leo, alleyway. Patient is down again. I think broken ribs. And Leo," her voice cracked, laced with raw fear I'd never heard from her before. "I think the driver of that SUV, he wasn't alone. I saw shadows moving down the parallel street. Fast. They aren't police." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a random attack. It was an extraction, or perhaps a silencing operation. We were collateral damage caught in the crossfire of something deeply hidden. And whoever that gravelly-voiced man was, he seemed to be on the other side of whatever conflict this was. I looked down the street toward where the voice had come from. It was just residential homes, dark and silent now. Every window shuttered as if the residents were holding their breath, praying whatever horror was unfolding would pass them by. "Stay put, Maria. Secure the patient as best you can. I'm coming to you," I ordered, trying to sound firm. I took 3 determined steps toward the alley entrance, ready to push through the smoke. That's when a new sound registered. It wasn't a crash, and it wasn't a gunshot. It was the rhythmic, heavy thump, thump, thump of rotors cutting the air, growing rapidly louder overhead. Too fast for official emergency services. This sound was powerful, military grade. I looked up, shielding my eyes against the rising smoke plume. High above the rooftops, against the pale moonlight, a dark shape materialized. It was a helicopter, low, fast, and entirely unmarked. It wasn't signaling or hovering. It was moving with precision, heading directly toward our intersection. Panic seized me. If the attackers were affiliated with this vehicle, or if the gravelly voice belonged to some rival faction, we were about to be caught directly in the middle of a much larger confrontation. I dove back behind the wreck, pulling my radio closer. "Maria, forget the alley. The chopper is hostile. We need to get out of line of sight now. Move toward the park on Elm Street." "I can't move him fast enough, Leo. He's—" Her transmission cut out abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched electronic whine that felt like drilling into my inner ear. The chopper was directly over us now, the downdraft powerful enough to whip the smoke into chaotic swirls around the ambulance. Suddenly, a bright, focused beam of light pierced the swirling smoke, pinning me directly where I crouched. It was blindingly intense, designed not just to illuminate, but to disorient. Then, a speaker mounted on the belly of the aircraft crackled to life, the voice booming down, cold and synthesized, utterly devoid of human inflection. "Ambulance Unit 7 Delta, you are in a restricted recovery zone. Cease all movement. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination of threat. Termination, not arrest. Termination. Before I could even decide whether to surrender to the blinding light or dive into the unknown, the helicopter dipped suddenly. From its undercarriage, something detached with a sharp hiss. It wasn't a grappling hook, and it wasn't obvious weaponry. It was a small, metallic sphere, glowing faintly, dropping silently toward the ground directly between me and the alley entrance where Maria was hidden. It landed softly on the asphalt, less than 5 feet from my head, and began to emit a low, rapidly escalating hum. It was a timer. I scrambled away from the sphere, adrenaline overriding all caution. I looked wildly toward the alley. I had to get Maria, when I saw her shadow flicker at the mouth of the passage. She was dragging the patient, moving agonizingly slowly toward the deeper shadows. Then, from the darkness just beyond her, I saw another figure emerge. Not the tall attacker, but someone shorter, wearing tactical gear, moving with the same silent proficiency. This newcomer wasn't focused on me. He was focused solely on Maria and the patient. He held a different kind of equipment, something that looked more like specialized restraint gear than a weapon. But his intent was clear: secure the target, eliminate the witnesses. As the metallic sphere behind me hit a frantic, high-pitched whine, signaling its immediate detonation, Maria glanced back at me, her eyes wide with a plea for help, just as the tactical figure lunged. The world went white, then instantly black, as the sphere detonated. It wasn't a conventional blast designed to destroy structure, but a blinding, focused energy release. The light seared my retinas, vaporizing the darkness and leaving behind sizzling afterimages burned onto my vision. The sound was a concussive whump, but strangely localized, contained mostly to the immediate area of the impact. The massive downdraft from the hovering helicopter immediately swallowed the heat and the shockwave, pulling it upward. When my vision reluctantly cleared, my eyes streaming tears, my head throbbing from the close proximity, the scene was utterly transformed again. The asphalt where the sphere landed was fused, glass smooth and slightly glowing, but the ambulance, surprisingly, was still standing, albeit heavily scarred. I spun toward the alley, deafened and disoriented, relying purely on instinct. Maria. The patient. Maria was down, shielded momentarily by the bulk of the gurney she'd been using as a makeshift barricade, but the second figure, the tactical one, was on top of her. He hadn't used visible force, but his movements were overwhelming. He had Maria pinned against the brick wall, his hand reaching not for a weapon, but for the patient lying inert beside her. "Get off her!" I roared, launching myself forward, forgetting the helicopter, forgetting the threat from above. Survival instinct narrowed down to one target: protecting my partner. As I ran toward them, something else happened. The tactical man didn't react to me immediately. He made a soft, almost inaudible clicking sound into a device on his wrist, and then, with surprising gentleness, he shoved Maria aside, a shove that sent her skidding painfully across the rough ground, and hoisted the elderly patient over his shoulder as if he weighed nothing. This wasn't a robbery or a random violent act. They were extracting the patient. He was the target. The helicopter overhead responded instantly to the wrist click. A loud, mechanical whirring sound signaled the deployment of something large from beneath its belly. It wasn't a bomb this time. It was a winch system, lowering a thick, reinforced cable with a magnetic clamp on the end, clearly intended for rapid extraction. I was still 10 feet away from the tactical operative, who was now moving toward the center of the intersection where the winch line was descending. I launched myself in a desperate tackle, aiming low, trying to disrupt his balance before he could reach the ascent point. We hit the ground hard, rolling over the fused asphalt. He was stronger than any human I had ever encountered. Dense muscle, zero give. He expertly twisted out of my grasp, kicking my ribs with enough force to make me gasp for air. He ignored me, his eyes only on the descending cable. "Leave him alone," I wheezed, spitting out grit. He paused, looking down at me with a flat, emotionless gaze that suggested I was less interesting than a common insect. Then he spoke, his voice heavily filtered through his helmet, yet chillingly clear. "You interfere with authorized recovery. Step away, civilian, or face compliance protocols." Compliance protocols, a chilling euphemism for death. Maria chose that moment to re-engage. Despite being clearly injured, she grabbed a shard of metal debris, a piece of the destroyed SUV, and lunged at the operative's legs, aiming for the tendon behind his knee. The operative let out a small grunt of annoyance, dropping the patient slightly to fend her off. The patient, knocked loose, rolled toward the relative safety of the ambulance's shadow. This was the chance. I kicked out, catching the operative's shin, and then scrambled to the patient, pulling him toward the rear doors of our ambulance, seeking the cover of the heavy metal box once more. The tactical operative disengaged from Maria, who was now struggling to get back on her feet, favoring one side, and strode rapidly toward us, his movements utterly efficient. He reached the patient just as I managed to half-drag the man inside the back doors. "No!" Maria screamed, throwing her entire body weight against the operative's back, trying to shield the open doorway. He didn't even slow down. He simply moved his arm in a tight, practiced arc, striking Maria across the temple with the butt of his handheld restraint device. She crumpled silently, unconscious before she hit the ground. My blood turned to ice. I looked down at the patient. He was stirring, his eyes fluttering open, looking confused and terrified. Then I looked up at the operative towering over the doorway, the winch cable now dangling mere feet above us. "Last warning," the filtered voice stated. I had seconds. I couldn't fight him, and I couldn't outrun him. I looked wildly around the back of the ambulance. There was one thing left: the emergency oxygen tank, still secured to the wall mount. It was a high-pressure cylinder, and if breached, I grabbed the heavy wrench I used for tire changes, adrenaline lending me impossible strength, and swung it in a desperate arc, aiming for the thin metal casing holding the cylinder brace. The wrench struck with a dull clang, rattling the entire vehicle. The operative seemed momentarily distracted by the sheer recklessness of the action. He paused, his eyes flicking from me to the oxygen tank, recognizing the potential danger of an uncontrolled release. That microsecond of recognition was all I needed. I pulled my hand back, grabbed the heavy metallic oxygen valve knob, and wrenched it with all my might in the opposite direction of its secure mount. It shrieked in protest, but it turned. A thin, high-pitched hiss of high-pressure gas immediately began venting into the confined space of the ambulance cab, aimed directly at the approaching operative. He realized the danger instantly. He didn't try to stop me. He recoiled, leaping backward toward the descending winch line, shouting a rapid burst of coded language into his wrist communicator. The winch cable swung closer, magnetically seeking its target, the patient inside the back of the ambulance. I shoved the elderly man deeper into the cabin, shielding his head with my own body, bracing for the inevitable metallic connection of the clamp. The hiss of the escaping oxygen was deafening, quickly mixing with the deafening thump, thump, thump of the helicopter descending further to secure its prize. Just as the heavy magnetic clamp dropped down and connected with a solid thunk onto the patient's chest, locking him firmly in place for extraction, I jammed the heavy wrench sideways into the spokes of the oxygen cylinder's valve housing, wedging it tight. The metal shrieked, the pressure gauge on the tank instantly maxed out, and the hiss intensified to a tearing roar. The tactical operative was already halfway up the lowering cable, ascending rapidly toward the chopper's hatch. He looked down just as the oxygen tank, unable to withstand the impossible pressure, began to bulge alarmingly, its thick steel casing straining against the sudden internal violence. The tactical operative reached the hatch, ready to disappear into the machine, when the helicopter pilot, perhaps sensing the danger or receiving a final abort command, suddenly began to pull the winch line taut, preparing to lift the patient, and perhaps me along with him, into the churning air. But the oxygen tank couldn't wait for the climb. With a sound like a cannon shot, the entire top third of the high-pressure cylinder ruptured, blasting shrapnel in all directions, including directly up toward the descending winch cable and the hovering aircraft just above the roofline. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the world to end in fire and twisted metal, but instead I felt a sharp, agonizing tug as the winch cable snapped under the force of the shockwave, the heavy clamp instantly detaching from the now loosening patient. The patient dropped. Not far, only a few feet, but enough. The tactical operative, now clinging precariously to the broken line, lost his grip on the cable and plummeted downward, crashing heavily onto the roof of the ambulance, directly above my head, just as the helicopter, crippled by the debris, pitched violently sideways and began a terrifying, uncontrolled descent toward the surrounding suburban homes. The impact of the tactical operative hitting the ambulance roof sounded like a falling piano, heavy and sickeningly final. Immediately following that, the air was filled with the tortured screech of metal against metal as the massive helicopter, listing dangerously, scraped violently against the eaves of the house next door. The sound was excruciating, a drawn-out death rattle that promised catastrophic destruction. I didn't wait to see if the operative on the roof would recover. I threw myself sideways off the patient, rolling toward Maria, who was still prone near the alley entrance. The interior of the ambulance was now a toxic cloud of escaping oxygen, making every breath a desperate gamble. "Maria, wake up!" I slapped her cheek, hard. She groaned, her eyes opening sluggishly, glazed with pain. "We have to move, now! Chopper's coming down!" She managed a weak nod, pushing herself up on one elbow, her hand flying to her temple where the impact had landed. The elderly patient was still inside the back, groaning weakly, thankfully cushioned by the mess of supplies. We had mere seconds before the plummeting helicopter either crushed us or exploded. The tactical man on the roof must have been momentarily stunned by the impact. He hadn't moved since landing. I grabbed Maria's arm, pulling her upright. "The park! Elm Street! Go!" We stumbled out the shattered passenger door, dragging Maria, leaving the patient as a decoy for the moment, hoping the collapsing aircraft would absorb the remaining threat. We staggered onto the street just as the helicopter lost its fight against gravity entirely. It didn't crash in a fireball. It simply buckled, the main rotor blades shearing off with whip-like cracks that sent debris flying in a deadly radius. The fuselage slammed down perhaps 50 yards away, crushing several parked cars and churning up the pavement in a cloud of dust, hydraulic fluid, and burning electrical components. We ran blindly toward the nearest shadows, weaving around mailboxes and leaping over pristine lawns. The silence following this second, larger disaster, even more unnerving than the first. It was the sound of catastrophic failure. The sound of a carefully executed plan falling apart spectacularly. Maria was leaning heavily on me, favoring her leg, muttering about the patient. "We have to go back for him, Leo. We can't leave him." "We can't get close until we know what that was," I hissed, pulling her toward the thicker cover of the oak trees lining Elm Street. "That chopper wasn't standard issue. Whoever they are, they're equipped like a paramilitary unit. That means they have ground support. And they know we saw their faces." As we broke through the tree line and started running toward the relative darkness of the small community park, I risked a look back. Fire trucks and police cruisers were beginning to arrive in the distance, their sirens finally starting to cut through the shock-induced quiet. But before any official response could reach the immediate scene, something else caught my eye. From the dense smoke rising where the ambulance had been, two distinct figures emerged. They were moving with unnerving speed, dodging the debris, heading directly toward the crumpled patient we had abandoned inside the wreck. One was the heavy-set man who had fired the initial shot. The other was the tactical operative who had been thrown from the helicopter roof. They were working together now, smoothly retrieving their objective from the wreckage. They weren't concerned about the fire or the crash. They were retrieving the package. They got him. Maria whispered, her voice hollow. "They got the patient." But as they turned to retreat back into the smoke, away from the arriving sirens, the heavy-set man stopped suddenly, scanning the area. His eyes locked onto our position in the park. He didn't hesitate. He raised the dark weapon once more, aiming directly at our position, visible now in the distance through a temporary thinning of the smoke. "Run!" I shoved Maria forward, diving behind a thick cluster of park benches, just as the first round screamed overhead, impacting a nearby lamppost and showering us with sparks. We scrambled through the park, a desperate sprint for cover, my mind racing. They knew our faces, they had the asset, and now they were actively hunting the witnesses. We were exposed, vulnerable, and miles from backup we could trust, not after seeing the professionalism of the extraction team. We reached the edge of the park, the sidewalk leading onto a major, well-lit boulevard. I pulled Maria to a stop behind a bus shelter, peering out, trying to gauge how close the hunters were. The two figures were emerging from the smoke cloud, moving with chilling confidence toward the main street, clearly intending to intercept us before we could reach the main road and flag down official help. They were professionals, and they were closing the distance far too fast. Then I saw it. Parked right across the boulevard, idling silently under the bright streetlights, was a completely unmarked black sedan. It wasn't the kind of car you see every day. It was low-slung, tinted obsidian black, and it looked built for speed and anonymity. The driver's side window silently slid down. Sitting in the driver's seat was the man who had shouted the warning, the one with the gravelly voice. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was dressed in a simple, expensive-looking dark coat, and he looked directly at us, his face unreadable in the half-light. He didn't look like law enforcement. He didn't look like the attackers. He looked like a CEO who had just witnessed a serious breach of contract. He didn't shout this time. He just nodded once, curtly, toward the passenger seat of his sedan. Then he reached over and opened the door. An unspoken, terrifying invitation hanging in the air between us and the two armed men rapidly approaching from the smoke-filled intersection. He was offering escape. But stepping into that car meant walking away from the scene, abandoning the patient, and putting ourselves entirely in the hands of a complete unknown, one who clearly had his own high-stakes conflict brewing. As the two armed operatives broke into a full sprint, the gravelly-voiced man tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel, waiting to see which side we would ultimately choose to betray ourselves to. The choice was instantaneous, not a decision born of logic, but of pure, raw survival instinct pitted against the immediate threat. The two armed men emerging from the smoke, the heavy-set shooter and the tactical specialist, represented certain capture or death. The man in the black sedan, mysterious though he was, represented a momentary reprieve from immediate violence, a chance to breathe, even if it was the air of a trap I couldn't yet perceive. "Go, now!" I shoved Maria hard toward the sedan. There was no time to argue, no time to look back at the flickering fires consuming the intersection. We sprinted across the wide, empty boulevard, the headlights of the black car catching us in their glare. We piled into the back seat, me slamming the door shut just as the first round from the heavy-set man's weapon pinged off the thick rear window, a sound instantly absorbed and muted by the specialized glass. The driver didn't flinch. He merely put the car into drive, the engine barely registering a sound, and pulled away from the curb with horrifying smoothness, accelerating into the night. As we sped away, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The two figures from the scene were standing frozen at the edge of the street, momentarily confounded by our escape. They weren't pursuing yet. They were calling in. I could practically feel the network of their organization mobilizing behind us. "Who are you?" I demanded of the driver, my voice still tight with adrenaline. Maria was slumped beside me, clutching her head, breathing shallowly. The driver finally turned his head slightly, his expression grim under the dim interior lighting. He looked older than I first thought, with lines etched deep around eyes that missed nothing. "My name is Elias, and you, Leo, and your partner just stumbled into a geopolitical retrieval operation that went sideways. Very, very sideways." "Geopolitical? That man was trying to kill us," I countered. "And what about the patient? Who was he?" Elias spared a brief, chilling glance toward the patient, who was now stirring slightly on the floor of the back seat, cushioned by the blankets Maria had thrown over him. "The man you call patient is vital data. He carries information that a hostile organization, one you just saw in action, the ones with the unmarked helicopter, were desperately trying to neutralize before it reached secure hands." "Neutralize?" I felt sick. "You mean they were going to silence him and we were just in the way?" "Precisely," Elias confirmed, keeping his eyes on the road as he seamlessly merged onto the highway, moving with a practiced, almost invisible agility that suggested he was entirely familiar with evading pursuit. "The people who hit your ambulance, they work for a shadowy network specializing in silencing threats to corporate and sometimes state interests globally. They wanted the data gone, permanently. They don't care about witnesses." "And you?" Maria croaked, wiping blood from her forehead. "Who are you working for? A rival group? Are you going to dump us on the side of the road next?" Elias sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "I work for an internal oversight structure. We monitor rogue elements trying to destabilize things for profit. We were alerted to the retrieval attempt too late to stop the initial engagement, but we knew the area had become compromised." That was my voice you heard, the warning. I intended to intercept the hostile extraction team, not join it. You were simply caught in the crossfire between two very dangerous factions. He glanced back again, a flicker of something like empathy crossing his face. "I provided a viable exit vector, which you took. That was smart. My priority now is securing the asset and ensuring your safety, because if the organization running those operatives finds out you survived, you will be hunted relentlessly. They won't care about jurisdiction or protocol. They'll simply erase the loose ends." He reached toward the center console and pressed a discrete button. A holographic map projected into the air between the front seats, showing a highly detailed topographical view of the region, marked with numerous warning icons. "We are currently moving to a secure deep site location," Elias stated. "We need to get the patient, and you, off the grid entirely. You saw weapons capable of bringing down aircraft. You witnessed an attempted, lethal extraction of a high-value target. You are now witnesses to matters that go far beyond municipal jurisdiction." He paused, his focus sharp. "The good news is, the main threat, the hostile team, has likely been delayed by the crash of their primary transport. They will be regrouping and cleaning up the wreckage, trying to ascertain if the asset was recovered." "And the bad news?" Maria asked, her voice regaining a little strength, perhaps bolstered by the sudden clarity of the situation. It was no longer a random attack, but a conspiracy they were caught in. Elias met my eyes in the rearview mirror. "The bad news is that the explosion from the oxygen tank damaged critical tracking equipment on the wreckage. The intelligence community now believes the asset was destroyed in the ambulance explosion, along with the EMTs. You two. You are officially presumed deceased." My stomach lurched. Deceased. An immediate, clean slate provided by chaos. "That gives us a window," Elias continued, speeding up slightly. "A small window where they won't be looking for us in the public sector. But that window closes the second you contact anyone. Anyone at all. Family, dispatch, news, with the truth. You must vanish. You must assume new identities, Leo. You can never go back to EMT work. You can never contact your past lives. Because if you do, they will find you, and they will finish what they started tonight. The only way you survive this is by disappearing completely into the life I offer you now, a life where you are already dead." He slowed the car as they approached a narrow, unmarked exit ramp leading into absolute darkness, flanked by high concrete barriers that looked like the entrance to an underground bunker. "The patient needs medical aid only we can safely provide," Elias said, his voice hardening with finality. Once we secure him, you two will be escorted to new lives. You choose. Walk away from everything you know and live in the shadows, or try to reclaim your old identities and face a well-funded, ruthless network who will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Welcome to the life after the ambulance stop, Leo. Which way do you turn at the end of this dark road?